So, I've been thinking about the nature of my contributions for today because I'm appreciative of the interventions of so many that have gone before me. And so I wanted to start by referencing a report that came out. So recently, according to a report by the International Idea think tank that came out just last month, the US found itself on this list of so-called backsliding democracies. And this is supposedly for the first time, right? And this is linked to supposedly the Trump years, and in some of the measures that were used to make this decision were people's loss of confidence in the so-called democratic process in the U.S., pushbacks against freedom of assembly, which we saw largely in the summer of 2020 amidst the George Floyd protests. But what I really found interesting about this assertion that this happens to be the case for the first time is that even just over the scope of the last 20 years, it ignores things like the 2001 presidential election of George Bush, where he was essentially determined president by the Supreme Court, where there was so much debate and fight over sort of election and voter fraud. And then even if we go back further than that, to the sort of origins of this country. The US is a settler colonial project that was made possible only through the dispossession and genocidal atrocities committed against indigenous peoples, and then fortified by the dispossession, the disenfranchisement, and the forced labor of enslaved Africans. And that those two things made it possible to create a sort of this so-called capitalist bourgeois democracy. So whatever nominal democracy can be found in the U.S. must be first and foremost challenged by the country's inability to acknowledge the humanity and facilitate a dignified life for the two ethnic groups of people who have formed the sort of basis of this country, right? And even as Luna already mentioned, when she cited Nyere's critique of the democratic process in the U.S., that the Republican and Democratic parties essentially represent two sides of the same coin. They fundamentally have the same interests. There might be some very nominal differences in the way some domestic policies are implemented, but when it comes to international policies, they essentially share the same positions. But what's also interesting is that the US fundamentally understands itself as a democracy based on electoral processes, right? And these sort of liberal notions of the idea of the individual. But even if we assess the sort of democratic nature of the capitalist bourgeois democracy in the US on its own terms and based on its own metrics, we see that even based on that, it is a failure, right? Because we know that in the US, less than half of the population participates, less than half even of the voter eligible population participates in electoral processes, right? And so that means that we have a country that is largely governed by, it is not governed by the consent of the majority. It is governed by a select few people who have been, for the most part, lied and coerced into electoral processes. And it's interesting because one of the things that, according to the so-called the Declaration of Independence, that we're supposed to have access to in this country is the right to depose elected officials when they are no longer maintaining their promises, right? So that we're supposed to be, that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. But this is something that is ostensibly out of reach, and in any sort of practical way is out of reach to us in the US. But beyond that, it's something that I think is inconceivable to most US citizens. There's no denying the fact that coups d'états are largely a result of sort of political sort of disruption in order. But one of the things that I think is interesting about coups d'états and our inability to enact them in the US is that I actually do think that they represent, when they are not military coups d'états, they represent a fundamental belief in the ability to hold people accountable, to hold our officials accountable to the promises that they make. We really, for all intents and purposes, lack that ability to do so in the US. I think two of the other sort of more egregious ways that we see the farce or the joke of American democracy is the US complicity in supporting the genocidal settler colonial project of Israel. and its determination to impose Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela, a person who in January 2019, when he was supposed to be president, less than 1% of the country knew his name, right? But I think even in the context of the US, what becomes interesting in this moment as we see fights over critical race theory, we see a fundamental fight over the educational project in the US. And there seems to be in the US a refusal to create a fundamentally educated critical electorate or population, right? And there is an interest in divesting from public education. And so I think two of the sort of most fundamental ways that we can see what a democratic state, the commitment of a democratic state to its people, are investments in education and healthcare and housing, right? And that is something that we fundamentally see the US lacking. And so what I wanted to maybe end on is a reflection that I made last year in watching the way that Cuba and Venezuela handled the COVID-19 pandemic in contradistinction to the sort of way that the US handled the pandemic. So in the immediate aftermath of the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, Castro and his cabinet, based on the logic informing socialist beliefs that everyone has an equal right to life and dignity, poured significant amounts of government resources into universal healthcare and educational systems. Revolutionary Cuban internationalism is a product of the desire to counter the prevailing McCarthyian logic of the day and spread revolutionary socialist ideas in Africa, Latin America, and the rest of the world. For more than 6 decades, the Cuban internationalism has been seen at play all over the world. The country is perhaps best known for its medical diplomacy programs, sending doctors all over the world, mostly to so-called developing nations. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Cuba and Venezuela were among the first countries to offer assistance, even before the national, state, or even local Louisiana governments. The US State Department rejected these offers of assistance. When in 2010, Haiti was devastated by a massive earthquake and subsequent tremors, the US State Department once again attempted to block much needed aid from Venezuela, as well as other foreign aid, while opting to send more than 6,000 US troops to effectively enact a military occupation. Then Foreign Minister Nicolas Maduro reported that aid shipments to Haiti were being diverted via the neighboring Dominican Republic to avoid restrictions imposed by the US at the Port-au-Prince airport. Doctors Without Borders has also criticized the US prioritization of military logistics over food and medical aid, saying planes carrying urgently needed surgical equipment and drugs have been turned away 5 times, and even though the agency received prior authorization to land. During the same period, thanks to Venezuelan-owned Citgo Oil's heating subsidies, thousands of American citizens received heating services for several brutal Northeastern winters. The COVID-19 pandemic presented a unique and almost unprecedented opportunity for Cuba to enact its medical diplomacy all over the world, even in so-called developed nations that have attempted to condemn the country to the status of perpetual political pariah. In mid-March of 2020, a British cruise ship had at least 5 individuals on board who tested positive for the novel coronavirus. An additional 22 guests and 21 crew members were isolated because they were experiencing influenza-like symptoms. After weeks of being stranded at sea because many Caribbean countries refused to allow them to dock for fear of spreading the virus, Cuba, out of humanitarian concern, allowed the ship to dock at their Mariel port, as part of what they understood as their responsibility in a global shared effort to confront and stop the spread of the pandemic. The Cuban government allowed the ship with approximately 600 British nationals on board to dock and begin the repatriation process. Later that same month, more than 50 Cuban doctors arrived in Italy's worst affected region, Lombardy, to help fight the virus. In late April, more than 200 Cuban doctors arrived in South Africa to help fight the virus there. Similar delegations were sent to Venezuela, Nicaragua, Jamaica, Suriname, and Grenada, to name a few. Despite the decades-long embargo imposed on Cuba by the United States and its neo-colonial allies, COVID-19 has provided an opportunity for the Cuban government to demonstrate the moral imperative driving its support for life across the globe, even as the racial capitalist interests of the US attempted to starve the nation. In neighboring Venezuela, after successive failed coup attempts to falsely impose Guaido as the US declared president of Venezuela, the US during a global pandemic with the highest unemployment rate since the Great Depression and an epidemic of racialized state-sanctioned violence issued a $15 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Venezuelan President Maduro, who the US Drug Enforcement Agency charged with narco-terrorism and drug trafficking, among other charges. The funneling of money into efforts to destabilize the Venezuelan government, while at the same time refusing to provide the necessary financial and sanitary assistance to its most vulnerable citizens back home, clearly demonstrates the United States' great lack of care and concern for human life. Despite the US unrelenting obsession and a severely damaged economy, Venezuela has attempted to manage the virus in a way that grants its citizens the most dignity possible. In June 2020, President Maduro participated in an online forum with the education minister and vice president of social and territorial development, who's now deceased, Aristóbulo Isturiz, and Noraima Gutierrez, Secretary General of the International Imperialist Cumbe of African and Afro Descendants, which was formed in November of 2019. The forum featured a discussion about Afro-descendant responses in the context of COVID-19. Maduro characterized the meeting as a continuation of initiatives that we have undertaken to coordinate the fight of social movements for justice against racism, colonialism, and oppression. And he went on to express his solidarity with the victims of police brutality, and in particular, the family of George Floyd. He concluded by asserting that the Venezuelan people have a lot of strength and conscience. They cannot keep us down. Our people are standing up. Venezuela shows its solidarity with the fight for equality for a better and new society. Concerning COVID-19, more specifically, Maduro contrasted the situation with the situation in the US and in Brazil, where racism and economic interests take precedence over human lives, by calling attention to the fact that in Venezuela, nothing is charged to anyone. Tests have no charge, and this is we've gone back and forth with charging tests or not.
If you could wrap up soon, Layla.
Yes, I will. I will. While far from utopias, Venezuela and Cuba's early handling of the COVID-19 pandemic exhibit a combination of strategies, policies, and perhaps most importantly, worldviews that promote the preservation of life over the accumulation of profit. Despite its self-conception as a world leader, the US has demonstrated everything but leadership. It is my hope that this discussion inspires a closer look at the projects underway in these two countries and others without the shroud of racial capitalist consumer logics promoted by world powers like the US and its crony countries. The fundamental right to life is what is at stake in determining what this post-COVID-19 world order could look like. We can choose to continue with business as usual, or we can choose to defend our right to the fundamental right to life, and learn from the examples of established and budding socialist democracies like Cuba and Venezuela in order to conceive of the new world that we must all believe is indeed possible.